The Alpha King rejected her in front of 40 witnesses, and the silver at her throat began, for the first time in 287 years, to grow warm. Marlow Kestrel had not expected to feel it happen. She had expected the humiliation. She had braced for that the way she braced for cold water, all at once, teeth set. What she had not expected was the talk at her throat, the one she had worn since she was 6 years old, and too young to remember it being placed there, to shift against her skin like something waking from a very long sleep. She kept her hands still. That was the thing she had always been able to do, the one skill that had never failed her in 19 years of being looked past. When her hands wanted to shake, she made them flat against her thighs instead, and she held them there, and the room never saw the difference. The Alpha King, Roderick Van Tane, tall in the way that made torchlight bend around him, dressed for a ceremony that was supposed to end in his betrothal, and not in this, had said the words plainly, without cruelty in his voice, which was somehow worse than cruelty would have been. "She is not my concern. She was never meant to be here." He had not even looked at her when he said it. He had looked at the woman beside him instead, the woman with the old claim and the older name, and Marlow had understood in the space of that one sentence exactly how small a person could be made to feel while standing perfectly still. She had come to the ceremony because she kept the linen stores for the East Wing, and the master of the household had told her the mending needed doing before the guests arrived, and no one had thought to tell her not to be present when the betrothal was announced, instead of the appointment she'd been sent to fulfill. She was Omega ranked. She was nobody's concern. She had known that for 6 years, ever since her mother died, and the household absorbed her, the way a household absorbs any orphaned thing that can be made useful. So when Roderick Van Tane said she is not my concern, meaning the mending, meaning the schedule, meaning nothing at all about her as a person, the court did not know that. The court heard a king dismissing a servant with unusual specificity, and 40 pairs of eyes turned to find out who deserved that particular sentence, and found Marlow standing in the doorway with a basket of unmended linen against her hip. The silver grew warm first, then it grew warmer. She set the basket down because her arms had gone strange, and when she straightened, Lady Cressida Marrow, the woman beside the king, the woman with the old claim, was staring at her throat instead of her face, and for one unguarded second, something crossed the noble woman's expression that looked exactly like fear. Marlow did not know why. She had worn the talk since she was 6. Smiths had tried to remove it twice, in years when she'd had lice or fever, and both times they had given up, embarrassed, unable to find the seam. It had simply always been there, a narrow band of tarnished silver sitting close against her collarbones, cool and quiet and hers. It was not cool anymore. She turned and left before anyone could tell her to. That was the correct thing to do. She had spent 6 years learning the correct thing to do in rooms that were not built for her, and leaving quietly before the humiliation could be compounded by an audience watching her feel it, was always correct. She did not know that Roderick Van Tane watched her go. She did not know that something in him, not his conscious mind, not the part of him that governed council votes and betrothal contracts, went suddenly, violently still, the way a held breath goes still, and that he did not understand why until the doors had already closed behind her. Marlow's days had a shape, and the shape was this. She rose before the bell, she kept the linen stores in order, she mended what needed mending, she ate at the second sitting with the other Omega-ranked staff, and she did not think about the parts of her life that had disappeared with her mother. She had a room in the lower quarters, with a window too small to let in much light, and a wash basin she kept scrupulously clean, and she had learned, the way people learn things they cannot afford not to learn, how to be invisible without being unhappy about it. She was efficient. She was economical with her words. She had learned which words were safe to speak in a household where speaking too much drew attention, and attention for an Omega with no bloodline and no patron was rarely a kindness. She had, in her 6 years at the keep, made herself useful in ways no one had asked her to. When a lower quarters wolf's newborn had come sickly 2 winters past, Marlow had sat up 3 nights running, boiling cloths and keeping the fire fed, not because anyone had assigned her the task, but because the pup's mother had been too exhausted to do it alone, and no one else had offered. She had never mentioned it afterward. The pup had lived, had grown into a clumsy yearling, who still, on the rare occasions their paths crossed, pressed its head briefly against her knee before running off, and Marlow had never once traded on the story to earn herself standing in the household. It was simply a thing she had done because it needed doing, the same way she did everything. The talk had been a curiosity in childhood, and then simply a fact, the way a birthmark is a fact. She did not remember it being placed on her. Her mother, before she died, had said only that it was old, and that Marlow was not to let anyone force it, and that had seemed at the time like the ordinary caution of a mother who had little else to leave her daughter. There was one soul in the household who had ever asked her about it directly, and that was Master Corrin, the castle's archivist, an old man who had stopped caring about hierarchy some time before Marlow was born, and who kept the deep records in a wing no one else visited. He had examined the talk once, years ago, turning her chin gently with one dry finger, and made a small sound of interest, and said nothing further, because Master Corrin never said anything before he had confirmed it 3 times over. She thought of him now, in the hour after the ceremony, sitting in her small room with her hands pressed flat against her knees, the silver at her throat cooling by degrees back to its ordinary temperature. She thought, I should ask him what he knows. And then she thought, it does not matter what he knows. Nothing has changed. I am still the woman who was told, in front of 40 witnesses, that she is not a concern. She was wrong about that, though she would not learn how wrong for 3 more days. Garrick Hollis, the king's second in command, had been standing near enough to hear the whole exchange, and unlike most of the court, he had not been watching to see who deserved the sentence. He had been watching Marlow. He had seen linen keepers come and go through that wing for years, had seen most of them make themselves smaller under the weight of a room like that one, and he had never once seen a person set a burden down instead of dropping it out of fright. He filed the observation away without understanding yet what it would come to mean, the way a soldier files away any detail that does not fit the shape of the moment. Roderick Van Tane did not sleep well that night, which was unusual for a man who had trained himself, over years of rule, to sleep exactly as much as duty allowed and no more. He lay in the dark of his chambers and found himself returning, again and again, to the moment the Omega in the doorway had set down her basket, not dropped it, not fumbled it, set it down, with a control that suggested she had needed both hands for something, and had chosen, deliberately, to free them. He did not know her name. He had said a sentence that had nothing to do with her, and everything had gone wrong regardless, and he could not account for why that fact sat in his chest like a stone he had swallowed. Something in him, not his mind, the mind that had already moved on to the matter of Cressida Marrow's renewed claim, and what it would cost him politically to accept or refuse it, had gone very quiet the moment the doors closed behind the woman with the basket. It was still quiet now. It had the particular quality of a silence that is waiting for something, though he could not have said what. He rose before dawn and found himself in the East Wing corridor, where the linen stores were kept, for reasons he did not examine. Master Corrin found her the next morning before the second bell, which was unusual, because Master Corrin did not rise before the second bell for anyone. "You'll want to sit down," he said, without preamble, the way he said most things. "Or you won't. Either way, I have something to tell you, and I would rather tell it once." She set aside the linen she had been folding. "About yesterday. About the collar you have worn since you were 6 years old, and have never once asked me to explain." He drew a heavy ledger from beneath his arm, its cover soft with handling. I looked after. I confess I had wondered before. A torque with no visible clasp is not an ordinary piece of jewellery, and I am not an ordinary sort of fool. But I had never had cause to search the old law. Yesterday gave me cause. He opened the ledger to a page marked with a strip of faded ribbon. 287 years ago, he said, the old Alpha Queen, Roderick's great-grandmother, 3 times removed, issued a decree that certain bloodlines, deemed too volatile for the pack structure of the time, were to be collared at infancy with a suppression seal. Silver, worked with an old binding, meant to quiet the bond before it could form. The decree was never repealed. It was simply forgotten, the way most old cruelties are forgotten once the people who ordered them are dust. Marlow's hand went, without her permission, to her throat. No one has worn a functioning seal of that kind in living memory, Master Corrin said. The smiths who could not remove yours were not incompetent. They were attempting to open a lock built to a purpose no smith alive has been trained to recognize. And yesterday, in front of the Alpha King, it grew warm. He closed the ledger. A suppression seal grows warm, according to this record, only when the bond it is suppressing begins, against every design of the binding, to complete anyway. Complete, Marlow repeated. The word did not fit in her mouth the way ordinary words fit. I am an archivist, not a prophet, said Master Corrin. I will not tell you what to do with this. I will only tell you that you have carried something on your body for 19 years that the entire pack believed extinct, and that the man who insulted you in front of his court yesterday did not know, when he said it, that he was speaking to his own bonded mate. Marlow sat with that for a long moment, in the particular quiet of the archive wing, where the dust hung visible in the single shaft of window light, and the old paper smelled the way old paper always smelled, like something patient waiting to be needed again. Why would anyone collar a child against a bond that had not even happened yet? Because the old Alpha Queen feared what she could not govern, Master Corrin said, and a bond, once complete, answers to no council and no crown. She judged it safer to silence the possibility before it could choose anyone at all. It was not aimed at you specifically. It was aimed at whichever child, in whichever generation, happened to carry the bloodline the decree named. You are simply the first one, in 287 years, that it did not manage to fully silence. That is not a comfort, Marlow said. I did not offer it as one, said Master Corrin, not unkindly. I offer you only the truth, because I have found, across a long life spent minding other people's forgotten records, that the truth is generally more useful to a person than comfort is. She did not go looking for him. That was important to her, in the days that followed, that whatever was happening to the silver at her throat, whatever old law had reached across 287 years to find her, she had not gone looking for it, and she would not go looking for him. He came looking for her instead, though neither of them would have called it that. She found the roster for the East Wing changed on the 4th day. Her name moved from the evening shift, which required walking the outer courtyard alone after dark, to the morning shift, which did not. When she asked the steward, he said only that it had come down as an administrative correction, and that the Alpha King had reviewed the household schedules personally that week, which was, the steward admitted, not something the Alpha King had ever done before. She said nothing to anyone about what she suspected that meant. She only noted, privately, that whatever else Roderick Vantane was, he had spent something. Attention, at minimum, which for a man who ran a kingdom was its own kind of currency, on a correction that cost him nothing publicly, and that she would never have known to attribute to him at all, if the steward hadn't let it slip. She thought of it again that evening, folding linen with hands that had gone still without her telling them to. She saw him 3 days later, in a way he did not intend to be seen. She had gone to the archive wing to return a ledger for Master Corrin, and found the council chamber door left ajar, the room beyond it empty of everyone but the Alpha King, who sat alone at the long table with a single candle burned nearly to its dish, holding a page of correspondence he had, as far as she could tell, been holding without turning for the better part of an hour. He did not look like a king in that moment. He looked like a man doing sums that would not resolve. She did not go in. She did not let the door creak. She stood in the corridor for the length of one held breath, watching the stillness of him, not the trained stillness he wore in council, but a different kind, heavier, the stillness of someone managing a weight he had not agreed to carry. And something in her understanding of him shifted without her deciding it should. He was not simply the man who had called her, not his concern. He was also, apparently, a man who read the same unmoving page for an hour in an empty room, and had a household steward reorganize an Omega's shift schedule without ever taking credit for it. She left before he noticed her, and she carried the image of him with her into the rest of the week, unresolved, the way one carries a question one has decided not to ask yet. Cressida Marrow arrived at court with the confidence of a woman who believed her claim had always been settled and would remain so regardless of what happened in doorways. She had been promised, years before the current king came into his crown, to whichever son inherited the northern seat, and she had waited out 2 decades of politics with the patience of someone who understood that patience, applied correctly, was its own form of power. She did not fear an Omega linen keeper. She had not, at first, understood why the silver at the girl's throat had frightened her in the doorway. She had told herself, afterward, that she had imagined it. But the fear had not entirely left her, and fear, in a woman like Cressida, curdled quickly into strategy. Cressida had spent 2 decades cultivating exactly the kind of reputation that made her difficult to move against. Gracious in public, generous with minor favors, scrupulously correct in every recorded interaction. She had learned, long before Marlow was born, that the safest kind of power in a court like this one was the kind that never had to raise its voice, because someone else's procedure could always be made to do the raising for you. She went to the council with a petition, not against the Omega by name. That would have been beneath her and beneath the council's patience, but a general motion, framed with impeccable procedure, that all household staff bearing unregistered restraint devices be examined by the court physician and, where the devices could not be explained, reassigned outside the keep for the safety and order of the household. It was not cruel on its face. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of motion that sounded like prudence. That was its danger. Marlow learned of it from the steward, who delivered the news with the particular gentleness of a man who did not want to be the one delivering it. She was to appear before the council in 3 days' time. If the physician could not explain the seal, and no one, Marlow understood now, would be able to explain it in the way the council wanted it explained, because the truth was older and stranger than anything the council was prepared to hear, she would be dismissed from the keep entirely. She did not weep. She did not rage. She went to her small room and sat with her hands flat against her knees, and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has survived worse, that she was going to have to choose something. She did not remain alone with it for long. Word of the petition reached the East Wing before the ink on it had dried, and when she stepped into the courtyard that evening, uncertain of her footing for the first time in years, she found Roderick already there, having heard of it through Garrick within the hour. He did not ask permission. He simply crossed the space between them and drew her against him, one arm solid around her back, her shoulder against his chest, until the noise of the courtyard receded to something distant and manageable. Neither of them spoke. He did not need to say that he had heard. She did not need to say that she was frightened. The holding was the whole of the conversation, and it was enough. She chose to go to Master Corrin's archive, and together, over the 2 nights that followed, they built the only defense that existed, the truth, the old decree, the 287 years, the record of a suppression seal that grew warm only when a bond, believed extinct, refused to stay suppressed. It would not save her reputation. It might, in fact, make things worse. A suppressed bond to the Alpha King was not a comfortable fact for a council that had spent a week planning his marriage to someone else. But it was true, and Marlow had decided, somewhere in the last 5 days, that she was done being handled by other people's convenient omissions. The scene that had nearly happened 3 times that week, in a corridor, in a doorway, once in the kitchen yard when he had come looking for a report the steward could easily have delivered himself, happened again on the night before the council was to meet, and this time it did not stop short. She was carrying the last of the mending back to the linen store when she found him in the passage, alone, no retinue, which was unusual enough that she nearly turned back. He did not order her to stop. He simply said her name, which she had not told him, and which she understood, with a small cold drop in her stomach, meant that he had gone and found it out, deliberately, from someone. "Marlow," he said again, as if testing that it fit. "Your Grace." "I did not mean you," he said, without preamble, the words coming out clipped and inadequate, even to his own ear. "The day of the ceremony. What I said, I meant the schedule. I did not know you were standing there, and I did not think, when I said it, that it would land on a person." "It landed on a person," she said. Quiet. Not accusing. Simply true. "I know that now." Something in his jaw worked, once, and stilled. "I have not stopped thinking about the way you set the basket down instead of dropping it." It was such a small thing to have noticed. She had not expected him to have noticed it at all, let alone to say so, standing in a corridor at an hour when neither of them had any business being anywhere near each other. "You changed my shift," she said. The evening rota was unsafe for a woman walking the outer court alone. He said it the way he said most things, like a report, factual, giving her information rather than asking for anything in return. That is all it was. That was 6 days ago. I am aware of how long ago it was. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. The candle in the wall sconce guttered, throwing his face half into shadow, and she found herself watching the specific stillness of him again, the stillness she had seen through the council door, and understanding that whatever this was, it had already gone past the point where either of them could pretend it was administrative. He lifted his hand. She saw it happen, saw the intention in it, the same way she had seen him hold that unmoving page for an hour, and stopped it an inch from her jaw, as if some old discipline in him had caught the motion before it could complete. Somewhere down the passage, a door opened, voices carrying ahead of footsteps, and he withdrew the hand before it had ever landed, and the moment closed over itself the way still water closes over a dropped stone. No mark left on the surface, though something had unmistakably gone under. "I have a council appearance tomorrow," she said, because it was true, and because it was easier to say than anything else sitting in her chest. "Regarding this," she touched her own throat, briefly. Something in him went very still, in an entirely different way. "Explain that to me." She did. "Fear'll break." He did not raise his voice. That was afterward the detail the household staff who witnessed it would repeat to each other in low voices for months, that the Alpha King had not shouted, had not struck the table, had simply gone silent in a way that made 3 lords near him take an involuntary step back. He had learned in the corridor of the council's petition, and of what it would mean for a woman who had done nothing but exist under a 287-year-old cruelty she had not chosen and could not have explained even if asked directly. He had learned in the same conversation precisely what the warmth at her throat had meant on the day he insulted her in front of his own court. His hands, when he set them flat against the council table the following morning, arriving unannounced before the session the lords had prepared for Marlow's dismissal, did not shake. They simply pressed down with a stillness so total that the wood beneath them seemed to hold its breath. "The petition is withdrawn," he said. Cressida Marrow, seated where she had expected to preside over a quiet victory, opened her mouth to object to procedure, and found that the room had gone the particular kind of silent that precedes something no one present had ever seen the Alpha King do before. "I will not raise my voice in this chamber," Roderick said, "because I do not need to. I would ask instead that the Council review the household records I am placing before you. The decree of the old Alpha Queen, 287 years old, and the report of the court archivist confirming that the suppression seal on Marlow Kestrel's throat, activated in this very hall 6 days ago, in response to a bond the Crown itself did not know still existed." He set Master Corrin's records on the table. "I would also ask the Council to consider whether it wishes to be remembered as the body that discovered its king's mate, and voted to expel her before the ink was dry on the discovery." The Council chamber the following afternoon did not resemble a battlefield. It resembled, instead, exactly what it was: a formal proceeding, procedural, unhurried, the kind of resolution that did not require anyone to raise a sword. Marlow walked in carrying the ledger herself. She had asked Master Corrin if she might, and he had said only that it seemed appropriate, given whose collar it was. She set the ledger on the table herself, opened to the marked page, beside the seal, which Master Corrin, working through the previous night with 2 of the keep's oldest smiths, and the decree's own recorded binding words, had finally, carefully, opened. It sat beside the ledger now, an ordinary piece of tarnished silver with its lock sprung, no longer sealed to anything. "I did not ask to be collared as a child," Marlow said to the Council in a voice that did not shake, "and I did not ask for what happened in this hall 6 days ago. But I am done letting a decree 287 years old decide what I am permitted to be a concern to." She looked, for the first time, directly at Cressida Marrow. "Your claim was made before I existed. It is not mine to answer for, but it is also not mine to be erased by. The vote, when it came, was not close." Cressida Marrow's petition was struck from the record entirely, and her claim to the Northern betrothal, built on a promise made before either party had reached maturity, and never legally renewed, was found, on review of the very old contracts she had relied upon, to have lapsed 11 years prior, without anyone troubling to notice. She left the chamber with her claim nullified, and her person entirely untouched, which was, Marlow understood, its own kind of ending. Not a destruction, simply a quiet correction. The institution folding closed around a mistake it had allowed to run too long. Roderick found her afterward in the corridor outside the chamber, where she had gone to stand for a moment alone, before returning to the linen store, as though nothing at all had happened. "You did not need me in there," he said. "You would have won it without me." "Probably," she agreed. "It would have taken longer." He was quiet a moment. Then, "I am asking you something now that I did not ask correctly 6 days ago." He took a slow breath, the kind a man takes before he commits to a sentence he cannot take back. "Stay. Not because a decree 287 years old decided it for us, because I am choosing to ask you to." She looked at him, really looked, the way she had looked at him through the council door when he had not known he was being watched, and found that the answer had already arranged itself somewhere inside her days ago, in a corridor, over an unasked question. "Yes," she said, plainly, the most clearly stated thing she had said to him yet. He put his forehead against hers then, in the empty corridor, and neither of them said anything further for a long moment. She felt him exhale, slow, deliberate, like a man setting something heavy down after carrying it a long distance. And she put her hand flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat settle under her palm, and that was enough for now to be standing in. 3 months settled over the keep, the way winter settles, gradually and then completely. Garrick Hollis had been the first of the household to bow to her, without being asked to, on the morning after the council ruling, in a corridor with no one else present to see it. A small thing, unannounced, the kind of gesture that meant more for having no audience to perform it for. The council had not entirely reordered itself. There were still lords who did not know what to do with an Omega linen keeper seated, on formal occasions, at the Alpha King's side, and their discomfort was neither hidden nor made into a battle. It simply existed, an old habit of mind the court would take longer to unlearn than a single ruling could manage, and Marlow had made her peace with that the way she made her peace with most things, by continuing to do the work in front of her. She still kept the linen stores, though no one required it of her any more. She still folded with the same economy of motion she had always had, still wore the mark of years of careful work, in the permanent softness worn into the pads of her first 2 fingers, still held her hands flat, and still when a room wanted her to be nervous. She had not become someone else. She had simply stopped being overlooked. The seals sat open now on a low shelf by her window, unlocked, unremarkable, catching morning light the way any old piece of silver might. It was no longer a mystery. It was simply a fact of her childhood that had finally finished happening. Roderick had taken, in the months since, to telling her small things, not declarations, never declarations, but reports, offered the way he offered everything, factually, as though the offering cost him something, and he intended to pay it regardless. He told her about his difficult history with the eldest council lord. He told her his opinion on the state of the northern roads, unprompted, over breakfast, as if it were the most natural exchange in the world. She had come to understand that this was his particular language of devotion, laying information down in front of her, the way another man might lay down flowers. One of the pack's newest pups, born to a lower quarters wolf, who had asked hesitantly if the new Luna might look in on the litter, a request that would never have been made of her 6 months before, had taken to falling asleep against her feet whenever she sat by the hearth with her mending. It was there again this evening, small and warm and entirely unbothered by the fact that it had chosen, of all the laps in the keep, hers. Roderick came to find her there, as he did most evenings now, and stood a moment in the doorway before entering, an old habit he had not entirely broken, watching her before she knew she was watched, and this time she looked up and caught him at it, and did not look away. "You changed my shift again," she said, not looking up from the mending. "The morning bell. I noticed." "I did not want you cold on the walk from the kitchens," he said, sitting beside her, the pup shifting but not waking against her ankle. "That is all it was." "That is never all it is," she said, and set the mending aside and let him kiss her. Once, careful, unhurried, like a man who had spent a long time thinking about how to do a thing gently and had finally decided that slowly was the answer. Outside, the last of the winter light moved across the stone floor, catching the open silver on the windowsill, and no one in the room was looking through anyone, and that, after everything, was more than enough. If a bond you never asked for, and a decree 287 years old had finally been allowed to complete anyway, would you have let it? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time.